Well, for more, we can speak now to Ibrahim Olabi, who is a legal advisor to the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He joins us now from London. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Before we speak about the findings of that UN report, I just want to ask you, it's been 8.5 months since the fall of President Bashar al-Assad. What's your understanding of the overall situation right now in Syria?
Well, the overall situation in many analysis and many experts see it as far better than predicted. I mean, this is a fall of a regime of 54 years. It was incredibly brutal, involved many foreign powers that had a sectarian nature. And usually when dictators like that fall, people escape and people leave and you have a mass exodus and sometimes break into a further complicated civil war. None of that happened. In fact, according to the UN, 1.7 million people are returning to their homes, 1 million from inside the country and 700,000 from abroad. We've seen investors come in, we've seen investors conference, we've seen sanctions lifted, we've seen diverse government formed, we've seen constitutional declarations, we've seen relative calm. But that does not mean it didn't come with its challenges. We have seen unfortunate events like the one that we will talk about today in the coast, the unfortunate events of Sweden, complex negotiations going on with the Northeast, but nothing incredibly different from what you would imagine a complicated military transition to look like. We've seen a lot of international attention, a lot of domestic support, but also a lot of criticism, which is also very welcome. And this is the kind of Syria that we're trying to build. We must not forget the legacy of the Assad regime and the challenges that are facing Syria today. So keeping everything together, for many Syrians, it's far better than expected.
Right, and just listening to what you're saying, and then we really will get on to the UN findings. But I mean, more than half a century of one family's rule of Syria, 25 years of Bashar al-Assad, more or less, half of that time taken up by a civil war. We've got multiple sects that live in Syria that have lived side by side for many centuries: Christians, Druze, Alawites, Shia, Sunni, so many different sects. You're saying there is a sort of a sense of inevitability that, given all of these dimensions, that there was bound to be some strife, and this was never going to be a completely easy transition.
Of course not. I mean, it's in the literature. Any country you look at that completely collapsed a kind of a police state and a military dictatorship that had foreign powers backing it, and the 14 years that you talk about during the armed conflict is also one that had close to 1 million people being killed and forced to disappear, a lot of grievances, many factions. According to the UN report that we'll discuss, more than 100,000 armed people that belong to so many different factions, who also all during the 14 years had their allegiance. So when you look at all the things that could have gone wrong with these variables, I don't think anyone expected the transition, on December 9th to look what it looked like. But of course, not everyone is happy that Syria is moving in the direction. There's a lot of grievances within. There's a lot of challenges. Syria is a very important country in the region, has its own internal dynamics. It's been very hard to kind of keep things on track. But for a country that, for example, just on sanctions had sanctions on it since the 70s, since most of those in power were not even born, to have them lifted within 4 months is quite a phenomenal kind of achievement, and to get the economy back and running and get investments and so on. But that should not distract us from also the real problems that exist and their underlying reasoning, which we are trying to tackle head on.
Okay, let's get on to the findings of those UN investigators. They've published a report relating to that violence in March in coastal areas of Syria, as well as around Homs. I'm talking mostly around Latakia and Tartus. 1,400 people reported to have been killed, possibly more. Most of them thought to have been civilians, women and children amongst them. The UN is saying that war crimes were likely committed by interim government forces and by fighters loyal to the former President Bashar al-Assad. What do you say to the findings?
Well, these findings are incredibly important, and they're incredibly important because of their context. So it's important to note that these UN investigators, they existed for 14 years because the Human Rights Council created them. But Syria, under the Assad regime, consistently objected to the renewal of their mandate. For 14 years, they used to call it the so-called UN Commission of Inquiry. They didn't even recognize it. In March, when the new government came, it recognized it. It didn't oppose its mandate, which got a unanimous renewal for the first time in Syria's modern history. And what also happened for the first time in Syria's modern history is that they were quoting their words, given unfettered access to these areas. It was the government that made sure that they could access the communities, they could access, investigate, simply because the government had nothing to hide. It acknowledged that abuses took place in the first in the first hours, really, of reports emerging, and it took a responsibility upon itself. It didn't just let UN investigators come in and say, "Fine, we'll wait for their report." It created a national inquiry, first of its kind, appointed by the president, that had members of the judiciary, civil society, respected lawyers, and so on, who published their findings. Again, lots of first-timers here published their findings in front of, not in a 5-minute press conference, not a 10-minute press conference, but in an hour and 30-minute almost press conference in front of media to tell them their findings, whose findings were not fundamentally different, not my words, but the words of the UN Commissioner Paulo Pinheiro, not fundamentally different from the international report, so which is quite a big milestone. What the report also does is that it really, deals with a lot of disinformation that we've seen circulating. So, for example, the numbers of people killed. The UN itself, by the way, could not reach the numbers. It had to quote other reports because, as I said, it's not simply easy to count in such a situation. Well, unfortunately, we've seen some media organizations and some other human rights organizations rush to conclusions in terms of numbers. It also puts the findings into perspective, the challenges that we've just talked about, the difficulty of security sector reform, the grievances that people felt that made them feel that they need to take revenge into their own hands, unfortunately, against civilians who, had nothing to do with the suffering of the people who killed them, but because they belong to a sect that did, and that sect also was explained, had its like about 3 pages part of that report to put things into context. It talked about the difficulty of accountability because we've inherited also the judicial system, the prisons, the judiciary, which was used at the time of the Assad regime as a really repression tool. And then it shed light that, most importantly, that it did not find any government policy to conduct these attacks, although they were widespread and systematic in their nature of targeting, but there was no command. The command was the opposite, was to halt any abuses, to get matters under control, which the government eventually did, which is also the report, something that they recognized, that for the same military factions, there are people committing horrific abuses, but at the same time, there were others who were committing or trying to protect life. And it puts all of that then into very kind of important recommendations to move forward. What is it that the government, within the resources, within the legacy, within the difficulty of transitional justice, within the resources it has, within external interference that we've seen, including from Israel and others, what steps could be taken? So all in all, it's an important finding because it aligns with the national findings, but it also sets the matters into context and provides helpful recommendation moving forward.
Okay, President Bashar did denounce that violence, and he said it threatened efforts to unite the country, which is what we've been talking about earlier on. He also promised to punish those responsible. Have people been punished?
Well, as the UN report notes, that there have been around 40-something people who have been detained. The national inquiry has identified more than 200 people from the government side, individuals who their names have been moved to the Attorney General. But it's also about taking a punishment into this wider context. It is for a situation like this, truth and narrative and fighting disinformation and showing that crimes took place rather than kind of trying sweeping them under the rug is a form of accountability. Naming and making clear that they were victims and they will have reparations and we need to find guarantees of non-recurrence is a form of accountability. But yes, we will pursue judicial measures. We'll continue pursuing judicial measures in light of the judicial system again that we inherited. We don't have ready-made courts, ready-made judges. There are very, very far few in country that are able to kind of deal with situations like this. Even the laws that we are using are laws that we inherited from the regime. They don't recognize war crimes, and that's not a matter for this government. It's a matter that we inherited the legal system and we don't yet have a parliament that can pass new laws in order for it to adapt within the kind of international legal standards that we would like Syria's legal system to have. So yes, absolutely, some have been punished, more to come. But for us, it's a wider effort that takes into account, truth and reconciliation and the guarantees for non-recurrence, and also importantly, reparations for the affected communities.
Okay, and just lastly, because we have to let you go, I just want to ask you, looking back at what's happened in Syria during the course of these last 8 to 9 months, what is the one event that stands out in your mind as being the most remarkable, the most unexpected, perhaps the most happy moment that you would single out from these last 8 or 9 months?
I mean, I think there were many happy moments, also some sad moments. Obviously, the fall of the regime and the way the regime fell without significant bloodshed was one of the happiest moments. I think the freeing of prisoners, the pictures of people who were in Assad's cells running out for their lives, finding children and women there, or who were missed for years, coming out meeting their loved ones. But also that event was also very saddening because many who were waiting for their loved ones didn't. And I think that then the following moment would be the easement of sanctions, the President Trump's decision and that of the UK and the EU, because it allows millions of Syrians to be able to rebuild their lives that were taken from them for no reasons. It allows, parents to sell their children to school, electricity to come back to their homes. And that's exactly what we're building. It's giving, Syrians a chance to be able to rebuild themselves after 60 years of dictatorship and 14 years of a horrific conflict.
Yeah, that embrace and that welcoming into the international fold in Riyadh of President Ahmed Bashar, definitely a standout moment as well. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Ibrahim Alabi, legal advisor to the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for your time, sir.